All right, everybody, welcome back to the Radio Forward podcast. I am very happy to introduce Steven Landry. He is the programming director of the Saskatoon Fantastic Film Festival, manager of film and digital print services at TIFF, and most importantly for our discussion today, programmer of Nightmare Alley at Revue Cinema. I just finished watching Targets at Revue, and that was an amazing experience, and I also got to speak to Steven at the end of the film and ask him to come on. So welcome, Steven. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Shawn. One of the best parts, honestly, to get real quick into it as far as like programming in the review right now is when people actually come up to me to say, that was great, or, thank you for promoting that, or, I've never seen that before. So that's because a lot of the times, we're watching stuff, alone or maybe at home, and there's real no connection between anyone or everyone. So that is sort of one of the beautiful parts of being a programmer at the theater, is just interacting with the people who are there and who are interested in what you're doing and who like the films that you pick.
Well, the Revue, as you know, is an institution of Toronto film culture and film enthusiasts. So, in an era of streaming, the Revue managed to get, at least once a week, a sold-out screening, and that's pretty remarkable for like a movie theater that in a world of streaming and watching films alone, like you were saying. So, let's jump into the sort of work that you do. How do you get into programming? What's your educational background? Is it as easy as just being really passionate about film and watching a lot of movies and then building a connection like that? Or do you have like a formal education that led you to this type of work?
For me, it was sort of falling into it in a way. Like I've been someone who's been in love with film since, I was like 4 years old, which was 100 years ago, and just was always around the film scene in Toronto as far as going to film festivals and going to TIFF and that sort of thing. And programming started for me because I was already working at TIFF doing print traffic, or film and digital print services, which is what it's been rebranded as for some reason, which is just basically, very basically, I was just getting the films into the building and getting them out of the building. And so I was already doing that. And I was a fan, and I was already attending a festival in Toronto called Toronto After Dark.
Right. And
the programming director, Adam Lopez, found out that I worked at TIFF and did print traffic, reached out to me to do their print traffic one year. And I said, yeah, sure, of course. This is easy. You're showing, just a dozen films or whatever. Like this is great. I would love to do it. I already like the festival. I'm already attending. That went well. And then he said, oh, you want to come back next year and do it again? And I said, sure, but I also want to program. So I did kind of fall into it, sideways, basically. There was a little bit more to it. That year when I was just doing print traffic for them, they had asked me, I guess, because they were inundated with submissions of films, and it's always been a very small team there, and just on a whim asked me, hey, do you have any interest in like watching some films for us and giving us some notes? And I said, oh, absolutely. And so I did that, and I guess that went okay. So then the following year when it came up again, I'm like, okay, but I want to be part of the programming team. And that's how it started for me.
Yeah, nice. And Toronto After Dark, is that also genre films and horror films that it's focused on?
Toronto After Dark is mainly horror, some sci-fi, some weirdness, but yeah, it's all genre films. And it was really outside of the Midnight Madness program at TIFF.
Yeah, right. I think they played. Didn't they play Conor O'Malley's Rap World there this year? Or am I mistaken? Is that it?
Rap World was part of Midnight Dankness.
Oh, okay. I am mixing them up. Yeah.
Midnight Madness. Peter Koplowski, who currently programs Midnight Madness at TIFF, does these little side projects, usually like the night before TIFF starts, and programs usually like way more obscure,
Yeah.
obscure films. And that was part of it this year.
Okay, but Toronto After Dark is it's separate from TIFF. It's its own thing.
Yeah, it's its own separate thing. It had already been running when I got involved, and I was with them for like a number of years as a programmer and doing the print traffic on the side.
Okay, awesome. And so why horror films? Like, why is that? What got you into horror films? Is that something that, like you're saying, you've been watching films since you were 4? Is that you were just clocked in right away on horror and genre films, or is that something also that you kind of developed over time?
Yeah, I think so. I was trying to figure out because, we had talked very briefly about what we're going to talk about today, and I couldn't quite figure out, what were the first horror films I watched and what my reaction were to them. They were. What I could sort of figure out is that I do remember very early on, I was probably 9 or 10, and my mom took me to a rep screening of Rear Window. Okay. Not exactly a horror film, but a thriller and Alfred Hitchcock. And I remember just being, blown away. Like it was, I was very, very young on top of everything else. And I think that sort of like jump started that, there were films like this. And so it sort of went from there. I've always been interested in, I don't know, just weird, spooky things as a child. I always had the books about ghosts or UFOs or things like that. And so I guess it was sort of a natural progression into it. And yeah, so I've always been into horror films, into genre films in general, depending on the sort of type of film. I'm not really into sort of like straight up gory kind of like slasher films necessarily, right. Although they are a lot of fun. I'll be seeing a Friday the 13th at the Revue Cinema on Friday.
Right, nice.
But generally my tastes are more towards just spooky, weird, building that sort of like that tension as opposed to violence necessarily or gore, even though there are a lot of films like that I think are fantastic and love, but it's not exactly my taste.
Yeah, Targets, actually, it's a great transition into Targets because that is I think a perfect representation of the sort of thriller that you're describing with Rear Window, where I guess you could consider it an exploitation film just because of the subject matter, but the violence is not gratuitous. It's extremely visceral. It feels very real. And I think for the American public watching that movie as it's coming out and not really having a conception of like mass shootings, and I'll give a brief description of Targets. It's a Peter Bogdanovich film who is not a horror director, is not really a thriller director at all.
Not at all.
He is a deeply Americana-driven director, right? Like Last Picture Show, Paper Moon, these are really like deeply embedded into American culture, really like recognize the machinations of what makes Americans tick and the sort of bleakness that follows in a small town in wanting to find yourself in a small town. And then you look at Targets and it's like it's so ahead of its time, knowing what transpired in American culture like 20 years and now into 50 years later. It feels like such a visceral movie, and at the same time it's a commentary on film itself. You have this let's see, what's his name? Oh yeah, you have Boris Karloff playing Byron Orlok, which is the hilarious mismatch of his name as like an Eastern European film star.
Not much of a stretch.
Yeah, right, exactly. So you have him playing Byron Orlok, this like aging horror film star who's realizing that he's not really making movies that people are impacted by anymore, and that's what his whole purpose was, to feel like he's making a film, a piece of art that people are actually impacted by. And at some point in the film, he says that, why do people need horror movies anymore? They can just look outside their windows or read the news, right? And so Targets is kind of like, it's kind of like this reading the news almost. It's like a reflection of how things are going. And so, what drew you to Targets? And I don't think it's a straight horror movie. So how does it fit into Nightmare Alley as a whole package?
Right. Yeah. No, it's not at all like a straight horror movie at all. I think in general, my sort of idea of the Nightmare Alley program is that, yes, it is pretty heavily skewed into horror. We also do like a little bit of like sci-fi and just sort of like cult, just weirdness. And so Targets is interesting in that it is a little bit of a cult film just for being so prescient, just for being so like, yeah, this was like this has been happening for so long. It almost seems like a shock that it's like, oh, people were worried about like shootings like sort of back then, but they were, as opposed to now where it seems like an everyday occurrence.
Yeah.
Targets came out, I believe, a couple years after the Texas sniper shootings, Charles Whitman, which was really sort of big as far as America realizing that there's a problem with guns and just with, the culture in general. And so, yeah, Targets is definitely sort of a comment on that situation. And as well, the timing of Targets coming out was part of the reason why it definitely did not do very well at the box office, because I believe it was only 4 months before the release of Targets that Martin Luther King was assassinated.
Oh, wow.
And 2 months before Robert Kennedy was assassinated.
Wow.
So it was real as far as America was concerned, which makes sense as to why no one wanted to go to a movie to basically see that same story.
Yeah.
And the connection with horror is so great. Having Boris Karloff as an aging horror actor in that film, and the sort of like that butting up against this new sort of unexplainable horror that America was experiencing with these shootings, felt very Nightmare Alley, basically, sort of where genre and sort of more sort of like art films or more sort of like politically driven films sort of collide. And so, yeah, it's something I've definitely always wanted to show as part of Nightmare Alley. And it's still, it's still chilling to this day because, it's only gotten worse.
Yeah, you warned the audience, I think, before the film started about like, this is a bleak film. You're going to be waiting until the last few minutes of the movie to get, although this is another topic I wanted to talk to you about, is that there is like this hilarious, like almost slapstick, hungover drunk scene in the movie between Bogdanovich and Orlov. And it's like, I wanted to discuss this intersection between horror and comedy. I mean, I just watched Black Christmas at the Revue. This is not part of this is not part of your program, but rather more like an example of this intersection between horror and comedy. And I mean, even like the most famous horror movies all have like massively comedic elements, like very funny punchlines in Scream. And I mean, Scream is more like it's more an obvious parody, but just looking at what you would consider a pure horror movie, they always have these elements of comedy. And so I was wondering what you thought about that. Why is that the case?
I mean, I think perhaps in general, horror, like where common, where when a horror movie is funny, sometimes sometimes it can be just a relief from sort of like the tension of the actual horror story that's happening. I think it's sort of relatable, like, dumb, goofy things happen to us like every day that, hopefully we laugh every day, I would hope. As opposed to, we're not all, in a horror movie every day. I think it's just a good way to sort of like tether the story to reality so that you sort of like believe, and the horror aspects of the film can be more scary because it seems more real, because because it seems like you're in the real world where funny things happen all the time. I think it's a good sort of like 1-2 punch, basically. Like, we're going to ease you into something, maybe, oh, this is super funny, like, let's all relax, and then
blindsided. Yeah,
exactly. Like, it can be used in a lot of different ways. Like, because there are specifically horror comedies, something like
Right.
Shaun of the Dead, which I think mostly is a comedy taking place in a horror world, as opposed to, the things that are funny in a film like Targets, which I think just sort of like ground it basically
Yeah,
and give
that's
you a little bit of relief in between sort of the tension of the scary things that are actually happening.
yeah, it feels like they have the finger on the pulse. The directors that really make something that's scary always have the finger on the pulse of what's funny at the same time. It's like the command of their audience's emotions is what makes a good horror movie. And so I think it's not just one emotion that they're able to manufacture. You
Yeah.
know, it's the relief, the comic relief, and knowing the punches, knowing the timings of the film is like super important too. And the thing that stuck out to me with Targets was just how real it felt. I mean, that's exactly what you're saying. It's like the what's his name? Tim O'Kelly, who plays Bobby. He's not really like a film star at all. Like I look at his filmography and there's nothing else really on the scale of Targets. He was in some really, really obscure cult films, but besides that, Targets was pretty much it for him. But the direction that he was provided and the performance that he put on was just super visceral, almost reminiscent of Falling Down. You know, Michael Douglas going through this same kind of psychosis process of and then becoming like this mass violence or mass shooting, or this vehicle for violence that terrorizes a community or whatever. Yeah, it felt super, super visceral. So I wanted to move back and discuss programming again. How much can you tell us about the process of getting a certain film that you want to show? Targets came out, I think, in =68. Is that right?
I'm bad with years, but it's around that.
Something like that, right? So what's the process of getting a film like that to play at a movie theater? Is it difficult and is it expensive? Is there like a negotiation process that takes place with the rights holders, or is it easier for older films to be played at movie theaters? I'm really curious about the inner workings, if you're able to give us details.
I mean, it really, really is a case-by-case basis. So yeah, a lot of older films that were initially released perhaps by a distributor that still exists is really not a problem. Like an old film, that Universal holds the rights to and put out initially is not a big deal to find, as long as they have an actual version of it in a format that you can screen, whether it's 35 or DCP, which is the digital format that screens in every theater sort of every day for a new film. Sometimes you do have to chase them down for like smaller films, because unfortunately a lot of films end up with one company, and then companies get bought up by other companies and then get bought up by other companies, and they don't necessarily pick up or pay attention to sort of like owning the rights to screen this film in a certain territory, which is also part of the problem, especially here in Canada, that we come up against. Is like, yeah, a lot of studios still have a lot of the films that came out, especially like sort of like in the 80s to 90s area, where there were mid-level companies in the States, and sure, they played it here in Canada when it came out, but then those companies have either evolved into another company or have just sort of disappeared, and so those rights disappear along with them. So there are plenty of films that legally you can screen in the States because those companies still exist and they still hold the rights to it, but they don't have the rights to screen it in Canada anymore. And so, I can't speak specifically to it, but as a theater who is responsible for, in general, like, you reach out, they say, yes, you can play this film, and then they will usually just dictate what the payment is for that film, whether it's a flat fee or a percentage of the box office, Like sometimes it's very just set in stone. Sometimes there's a little wiggle room to go, well, we're a smaller theater, can you do this? But yeah, so a lot of times there are films that don't seem to be even that old, necessarily films from the 90s, where there just aren't, no one owns the Canadian rights to them anymore. And so you run the risk as a theater of like, oh, okay, I'll play this because maybe I found a 35 millimeter print from a collector. Or, if you're like a micro theater, like maybe I'll just, I'll play a Blu-ray or whatever. But you run the risk of someone popping up and go, oh, hey, I own the rights to this and you did not pay me. And no theater wants to be in that situation.
Right.
So for the most part, unless it's a very small or very obscure title, a theater will not play a film that if they cannot find out who owns the rights to it.
I see. So, would you encounter that issue because the rights holder just isn't publicly available? And so you played the film and say like you want to take the risk because you can't, you're not certain that there's a rights holder in Canada, right? So you play the film and then it comes out of the blue that there actually turns out there is, and then they're looking to collect? Or is it more of a problem that, okay, somebody finds out that this movie is being screened, so they acquire the rights to it?
No, it's more the previous thing. And for the most part, I think very, very rarely will the review take a chance on that.
Okay, yeah.
Because it's just not worth it, because then, it may actually be a bigger distributor and you don't want to sort of burn that relationship.
Yeah, right.
Because they may have other films that you want to play in the future. And for the most part, the theaters doing a lot of due diligence. Like if it's not sort of obvious, then you may end up emailing every Canadian distributor that still exists
wow.
to find out if they own the rights to it. I've done that personally just for stuff I'm thinking about playing in the future, where I'm like, okay, I'm pretty sure this is the issue, so I'm just going to reach out to everyone who could possibly in Canada still own rights to it. And then sort of take it from there, and then sort of gauge based on perhaps how popular the film is, if the theater wants to take a risk on it.
Wow.
And I feel like I've really only done that once.
The risk, you mean? The risk taking?
Yeah. Like I took the risk, and the theater took the risk with me, and this was very early on of a film which has now since been restored. And yeah, we could not do the same thing with that same film again.
Right. So what was the film?
It was my very first film, Messiah of Evil.
Oh, wow.
Where literally, very small, American film, never had a large distributor. No one really had any grasp onto it. But I think it was just last year where a new restored Blu-ray came out, and a company is distributing it. So you would definitely go through them first to see.
So you had a very gutsy start to your career.
Yeah, it was kind of, and I can't remember. It honestly wasn't. I mean, it's a film that I love, but it's pretty under the radar and not perhaps the best way to start a series as far as normally what you would do if you wanted to, you're new, you're fresh on the game, and you want people to show up, so you would probably pick some films that are more well known, that people will come to,
sure,
and then you hope to grow that audience that way.
Or at the very least, you play Targets, which has a great director attached to it, and you're like, oh, this is his debut that's just so unlike his other films. And if you're into horror, there are ways like you're describing, there are ways of promoting yourself, but going away cult is. Yeah, that's a cool risk that you took. That's very interesting.
Yeah, it wasn't probably not the best way to do it, for sure. But it worked out okay. And then
that's awesome.
There is, I feel like with programming, at least for me, because even though yes, I'm doing mostly horror, I'm not super interested in screening films that everyone has seen or everyone knows about. And it's one thing, I mean, I absolutely want a theater to play, The Shining or Suspiria, like
Sure.
once a year. These are films that everyone knows, people will watch these, once a year for sure. Not a problem selling out a lot of seats to get people to come and see that kind of film. But it's not really what the point of my program is. Like, there are films in my program that are definitely bigger films by directors that people have at least heard of, but I'm way more interested in showing films that are a little bit more obscure that a lot of people have not seen.
Yeah, like Inside
And
coming up. Isn't that the Canadian premiere of that film in cinemas?
no, not
Oh,
Inside. Inside has played. I don't know if it played theatrically in Toronto. It was part of the Midnight Madness program
oh, okay,
the
okay.
year that it came out. So it's played in Toronto, and it's my January pick, which is a Japanese film called Nori, The Curse. Sort of a very small, sort of like found footage, faux documentary film, came out in either 2005 or 2007. Really only screened theatrically in Japan, but it became one of those films where people heard about it. People somehow got cuts of it and would put it up on YouTube, and then the distributor would immediately try to take it down.
Hmm.
It was never really, I think, legally you couldn't really watch it in North America, I believe, until Shudder, the streaming service, picked up the rights for it 2 years ago,
Hmm.
2 or 3 years ago. And it was sort of like the first time that you could actually see it sort of properly in North America. There was a recent Arrow Films put out a recent box set of J horror from the 2000s, and that was part of it. And AGFA, a company in the States, which release and distribute a lot of films, are making proper DCPs, so theatrical versions of all the films in that set. And so that's how I'm actually able to screen
Oh,
it at the
wow.
review. And I'm pretty sure, I mean, it's possible, underground screening rooms or whatever
Sure.
could have shown this film sometime in Canada between now and when it came out. But I think legally, technically, it's never been shown properly theatrically in Canada until January.
I remember reading that amongst your posts that one of these films, I mixed up Inside and the other one, but yeah, I can, from what you're saying about the purpose of your program, showing these underground films and really putting a light to films that otherwise wouldn't see the light of day in Canada, and jumping through the hoops, like you're saying, the story of Shudder picking up a film and then there's a distributor who is doing DCPs, like that is the sort of scavenger hunt that I was expecting from a cult film programmer. You know what I mean? That's very cool.
Yeah, it is. It is definitely part of it, and it's one of those things where I love that film. That film's always been on my list, but I've always sort of known there's no way to get a proper version that will look good theatrically. So you wait and you wait and you wait, and then I hear Arrow putting out the box set, and I go, oh, okay, well, Arrow at least has some restored version of it, and I know that AGFA, who are doing God's work, have been releasing theatrically a lot of films that AGFA have been acquiring. So I'm immediately emailing the guy at AGFA,
That's awesome.
Any chance? And he's like, actually, yeah. And I'm like, oh, fantastic.
Wow, that's amazing.
And I mean, that's been pretty rare, at least for most of what I've been showing. I don't think a lot of the films that I've been showing have been super rare. I think they're just sort of a little bit under the radar.
I see. What's been a film that seems impossible to show in Canada? Is there something that's just like your unicorn, like something like just your chimera, like something that you just can't seem to get on?
I think the most obvious film, as far as that is concerned, and it's not just me. I feel like it's a lot of programmers in Canada or all over the world at this point, because the rights have been in flux. There's been a lot of changes as far as who controls it, when you can kind of screen it. But Ken Russell's The Devils.
Oh wow, really? That's hard to play.
It's a film that I get asked about, and that's definitely gone through a lot of turmoil. Technically, I believe Warner Brothers owns the rights, and there were screenings like back in the early 2000s. There are prints available. That's also a film that a lot of people have heard a lot of things about,
Yeah.
as far as like, well, what version am I watching?
Oh, wow, really?
Because it's
Been heavily edited and censored, right?
Yeah. I mean, anytime you connect religion and horror and
Yeah,
sex,
of course.
and you can run up against these kind of things. And the Devils is sort of like that triumvirate of like, oh shit, like how did this movie even get made in the first place?
Wow.
And can we screen it? And it has. I was at a screening at the Revue Cinema, but it was probably 2008 or something like that. And for some reason, and I don't know the exact timeline, Warner Brothers, who I think still technically owns the rights for North America, just refuses to allow anyone to show it.
I see.
And that's a film that is also big enough, and it has that cachet, that has that sort of notoriety.
Yeah.
That I've been asked about.
I've heard
just
of it.
randomly,
Yeah,
like
for
people
sure.
on Instagram, like, oh, would you ever show this? And then I give them the bad news. I'm like, I would, but currently we can't. And sometimes these things change. You just never know. When.
I see. When you're deciding on a film that has multiple versions available to you to pick from, do you tend to go with the most complete version, like a director's cut or something that has as much content as possible? Or do you watch all the versions available and decide yourself, like, oh, this is actually the more polished and better version?
It honestly hasn't come up a lot with what I've shown so far. I mean, a lot of times a quote unquote director's cut is, perhaps what would have been an unrated version,
right,
if it was shown in theaters. But theaters, of course, don't want to show, unrated films. So.
Theaters, you mean big chains, right? Because I think Revue probably wouldn't mind something like that, right?
Yeah. But because of that, there may not be a theatrical version of the unrated version available. Because, because, well, we want to show this initially on its initial run, that's something that used to get thrown onto like a Blu-ray like a year later, for people to purchase. I think I'm trying to think of the. Yeah, I don't think it's really come up as far as anything I've shown at this point. And sometimes you are, though, just at the mercy of what the distributor will provide.
Yeah. Whichever version is available for theaters in the first place.
Yeah, like if there are multiple versions, like I think I would definitely prefer to show the version that I thought was better.
Yeah.
For sure. I mean, not a film I would show because it's a big film as far as like repertory goes, but there's no way I would play the director's cut of Donnie Darko because I think the original cut is so much better.
Yeah.
But yeah, it would be a case by case basis. I just don't. Yeah, it just hasn't really come up for me.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I'd love to give you the floor and give you a chance to shout out what you think is a underrated horror film, an underrated genre cult film that people watching this episode who are really into exploitation films, into genre films, should go out and see. Something that you think people maybe haven't.
I feel like I want to keep pushing, and I've done a couple of his screenings, but I really wish that in general the genre community would embrace Larry Cohen a little more. I've shown Q the Winged Serpent, and I've always wanted to show The Stuff, which is excellent sort of commentary on sort of like commerce and but they don't necessarily like draw as well. Like they're smaller movies, made on smaller budgets. But I love sort of he had ideas and he just went and he just shot them. And I think they're so great.
Yeah, we'll throw in some clips of The Stuff in Q in during this discussion.
Are great films.
Okay, awesome.
I think, although there has been a re-release by, I think, Radiance, the Blu-ray company, but Messiah of Evil, which was the very first film I showed, is one of my favorites of the genre. It's just a weird kind of like slow, like California haunted town film that I don't think gets enough love. Like that's definitely one of my favorites, and it was probably one of the reasons why it's like, okay, well, and I can't remember what I wanted to play first when the program started, but it's like, oh well, we can play this, so let's do it because I'm infatuated with it. Right, let me see. As far as horror goes, I feel like I should look at my.
Yes. Oh, let's see that. Let's see that wall that you've got. This is very cool.
Yeah, it's a problem. I mean, in general, buy DVDs, buy Blu-rays, physical media is the way to go.
100%.
Obviously, we all love streaming. It's so easy, but I mean, there are so many things that you're not gonna get on streaming, and they're gonna take them away eventually. So don't rely on that.
I will say, this is something I talked to the last guest that I had on, but I feel like I have been my tastes have been shaped by the internet and the unprecedented accessibility that I've got access to the films that I want to see on demand. And I mean, like, pirate-wise, you know what I mean? Art.
Right.
But that truly did shape and it's interesting that it's coming up again. And I think horror is like the perfect genre for this. Cult films are like the perfect genre for this because, first of all, how are you going to find a Blu-ray copy of a movie that got like 1,000 copies made of it? And then also like the beauty of it being posted to, underground forums, film discussion boards, all of this is that it suddenly has an audience and suddenly can shape the narrative of the films to come. You know what I mean? I think that cult films sneakily have shaped the biggest horror movie of the year, which is The Substance. Like, you know what I mean? So, it's just interesting.
The Substance. I waited, like it played at TIFF, but I do work there, so I'm usually very tired and can't necessarily go out to midnight movies. So I waited until the review got it and saw it in like a room with like over 100 people at like 4:30 on a Wednesday,
right,
or something like that. That's which crazy. Is also incredible as far as like people coming up the genre that is interesting. People still actually going to theaters.
Yeah,
which I think there is that idea that the theatrical experience is dying. Sure, a little bit of it. I mean, if you're only used to like going
to
watch some mainstream movies at a Cineplex and everyone's on their phones or like talking during it, then that's reasonable.
Yeah,
but
the Revue has cultivated such a culture of cinema experience where I always get a little stressed out in person watching a film that has not just problematic dialogue, but touchy themes and like where people might laugh inappropriately or find something funny that is just like clearly supposed to be very serious. The Revue has like an unbelievable aura where people follow the rules. People like give it their best because I think they are giving it their best. People are there to really be passionate and nerd out and really just love the films that they're watching, and it's just got like an aura about it. I don't know how they did it, but it's an amazing experience. If you've never been to the Revue, highly recommend going to see. I mean, a genre film would be probably the best experience imaginable. It's funny, it's going to be outrageous. People will react at any screening that you go to. I think there's definitely a spectrum, of course, at the Revue. I mean, you've got literally a program dedicated to this thing, which is like Drunken Cinema. It like basically asks the audience to participate, but you don't need to ask them at the Revue. How have you found the audience respond to your films?
Like overwhelmingly positive. Like, and I feel like I'm not even like, it's been a little while. I'm not surprised anymore. But I mean, and I tend to like sit in the very back off to one side.
Like Gatsby.
Yeah, a little bit, so I can see, I can see a
Yeah,
little
that's
bit of
cool.
how the audience is reacting, what they're doing, and to not see anyone pull out a phone for
It's
like 90
awesome. It must be
minutes
so, yeah.
seems insane in this day and age, unfortunately, but it is true. Like, I feel like part of it is my films do tend to be a little more serious, a little bit more of a bummer.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
I feel like either you're locked in to it or you're not.
Hmm.
And so I think like a lot of my audience a little bit know what they're expecting, and they're
Sure.
there to like to watch it.
Yeah, that's
to
awesome.
really watch it, as opposed to like be at a screening and say they're at a screening kind of thing, where it's like, because you get this thing where people feel like they need to take photos of like the title screen during the movie or whatever, and I feel like I almost never ever see that at one of my screenings. Like, I feel like I'm blessed a little bit that way.
Yeah, that's
as far
awesome.
as theater etiquette goes, like it's fantastic. And then it's not the opposite, but it's just a different version of the experience. Like you said, with Drunken Cinema, I'll be there to watch Jason X.
Yeah.
Probably my favorite Friday the 13th movie,
That's
which
awesome.
is a weird thing for a horror person to say, but that's going to be a party. Like, that's going to be, we're going to be
Rowdy,
yipping and yelling, and like, yeah, it's going to be a little rowdy, but that's part of it, right?
Yeah.
And so I feel like the Revue has really figured out a way to
cultivate that sort of audience.
Yeah, for sure. Like, especially, just even based on, what programmer is presenting the film, sort of what you're expecting, and sort of like how it's going to go. And so, yeah, I feel very blessed to be in that situation. And just a side note, just as far as my crowd goes, just because I am a little bit older, and for the most part, up until this month's film, Inside, which is from the 2000s, I've never shown anything prior to 1999. So watching younger audiences see these older films for the very first time, I always ask when I'm doing the introduction, like, who has seen this before? And it's usually at least 50% they have not seen this film.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's sort of like, that's part of why I really, really love it. It's like they're taking a risk in seeing something, 40, 50 years old for the very first time. They left their house to do this.
Yeah.
And hopefully they enjoy it, or hopefully it bums them out. That's also part of a lot of what I'm doing. But yeah, it's brilliant. I can't say enough about how the Revue has sort of cultivated that audience, and sort of like, yeah, it's hard to think that people think theaters are dying. Like, I don't see it.
No, me neither.
At least not at the Revue.
Not in Toronto either. I mean, just in general.
Yeah.
I think there's a bit of an aura around Toronto cinema and cinema culture, thanks to TIFF, thanks to all of the different cinemas, all the different screenings that you have at any one moment. I mean, I know Imagine it's a chain, but like Imagine cinemas are always putting on something interesting. You've got Paradise, you've got Fox, you've got Revue, you've got, it's the variety is pretty remarkable, and that's. I mean, it's part of the reason I love the city so much, and part of the reason I get to see so many screenings is, again, what's available. One quick...
Even though a lot of places have closed down, we're still kind of spoiled in Toronto.
Yeah,
as far as repertoire goes. So
I'm from Boston originally, and you definitely don't have that. you don't have that there. It's pretty, like, near the universities, like near Harvard and Alston and in Cambridge. You do have some independent theaters, but it's like you're parched for choice. It's really, it's pretty sad compared to Toronto, but it's hard to compare. I mean, the only comparison is really New York. Like, New York is crazy. The level, the number of screenings they have on a day-to-day basis is wild. But again, like, I was just in Chicago, and I was like, my dad and I are both super into film, so I'm like, hey, let's go see a movie. Not much choice. They were showing the Batman, like the Tim Burton Batman. I was like, okay, that's not much choice there. Oh, it's great, but I'm saying, like, there's just that was like the only, like, really interesting film. Although I will say, at the at the Siskel Film Center. They had Black Auteurs Film Festival, which was really cool. And so there is that variety out there. But yeah, again, like Toronto, we are really, really spoiled for this. Sorry, I wanted to loop back one quick point about how people decide which films they watch, because I've noticed the thing from my first foray into like discussing art and discussing media and stuff like that was music. And I always thought I figured out that metal fans, people who like heavy metal music, typically just like metal. They're like really big into it. They like the whole identity in the music world revolves around metal. You know, they have the battle jacket and a bunch of band patches, and they know all of these metal bands. People who are into, you know, the rest of music, I guess, tend to really like cast a wider net. The people into metal know all of the subgenres. They know all of the new bands, all of the new releases. They're really, really passionate, and there's like it becomes like this really insular inner circle. I think horror fans kind of have that same thing. And I was wondering what you think about that. People who like horror movies tend to really know all of the subgenres of horror. They tend to know all of the cult classics. They know, you know, the slashers, the exploitation films, all of that. Whereas the way I decided to see Targets in the first place was because I love Paper Moon, and I'm like, oh, Bogdanovich? Okay, I'll go watch it. And I was like, whoa, blown away by how different this film is, you know? So yeah, I was wondering what you think about that.
I mean, I think some of that is sort of true. I think there are certain genres that those fans sort of just lean into that very sort of narrowly. Horror, I think, is part of that. There are definitely folks that come out that are just into the horror films. And I mean, yeah, which is kind of surprising, at least as far as I'm concerned, because yes, obviously I'm putting on a series monthly that is, you know, probably 75% horror. And, you know, and that's a genre that I love. But it's not like my top 4 letterboxed films are not all horror. I think maybe only one is technically at this point.
Oh, what's your top 4? Yeah. I have to squeeze this out of you. I'm sorry.
Shit, I feel like I adjusted it a little bit recently, but I'm pretty sure currently my top 4 are Alien.
Nice.
The original. Play It As It Lays. The Frank Gehry film starring Anthony Perkins, which is such a bummer, but I love it so much. Wonder Boys, which is maybe an underseen Curtis Hanson film, and I think I switched something out to throw in because I'm a super huge fan of anything that David Lynch has done.
Nice.
Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me.
Yeah,
I think every time I watch
talk film, about a bummer, eh?
Stunned, but I'm stunned by sort of how beautiful and how heartbreaking it is.
Yeah,
like it's, yeah.
Nice. Okay.
So yeah, and a lot of the horror I love is definitely not necessarily like the super kind of typical like slasher.
Oh, for sure. It was a total generalization, but just an observation that I've made after getting into, well, the community, you know, like the cinephile community. When you get to discuss these things with people, when you get to discuss with people who are super passionate like yourself, and, you know, just a weird observation I've noticed, and I've made the parallel to metal because the horror films tend to have like a metal soundtrack, or it has like a bit of an overlap, you know. I will never forget watching Funny Games for the first time and being blasted by that Zorn jazzcore like introduction, which just like ripped my skin off my face. It was crazy. So that's kind of where I started thinking about it, actually, was that film. That was wonderful. I think we'll wrap things up. Steven, thank you so much for joining us. I appreciate you giving us your time, and I am looking forward to inviting me. Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing what you have coming up next with the review. So, thanks again for joining us.
All right, no problem. Thank you.